Are we ready, Max? Good. I'm going to start. When you get your drink, just come on. Good. Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. We founded the committee in 2003 after George W. Bush attacked a country that didn't attack us. The United States became a belligerent without a congressional declaration of war against Iraq. Imperial presence under the leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties have waged unconstitutional wars with abandon across the Middle East. The committee's mission is to teach constitutional literacy with the goal of bringing American foreign policy back within the limits of the U.S. Constitution. No power is more misunderstood and abused than the war power. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 establishes neutrality as the default policy of the United States until such time as Congress formally takes the nation from a state of peace to a state of war. Neutrality means refraining from providing non-humanitarian assistance to a belligerent in a foreign conflict. Make no mistake, since February 24th, the United States has violated neutrality by providing arms, intelligence, and personnel to Ukraine. Under international law, Russia has the right to attack the U.S. as a party to the conflict. Keep in mind that in our presidential wars of choice in Syria and Iraq, we invoke the doctrine of co-belligerency to exterminate any group or individual not engaged in active hostilities but providing material assistance to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Neutrality, as some like to say in Washington, and incorrectly, neutrality does not affirm a moral equivalence between the belligerents. Neutrality is a legal concept, not a moral concept. The concept of neutrality is embedded within the Constitution to discourage wars of choice not waged in self-defense. No one in American history, or for that matter in the history of the world, has more eloquently stated the reason for neutrality than Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in 1821. And I quote, "Whenever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will America's heart be. Her benedictions and her prayers be, but she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She knows well that once, enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of a foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force." End of quote. I love that man. During the 19th century, the United States grew rich as we religiously followed the Constitution's policy of neutrality. The Constitution's neutrality policy recognizes that all national borders from the beginning of time have been drawn and redrawn by the sword without the influence of justice. Ukraine is no exception. Initially home to Russia, Ukraine was absorbed successively by Poland, Lithuania, the Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary. Ukraine enjoyed an abbreviated period of independence after World War I until annexed by the Soviet Union in 1922, only to become independent again in 1991. Neutrality is the best policy to promote liberty worldwide, as Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky explained in opposing assistance to Hungary to fight the Russian bear. Quote, and I quote Clay, "Far better it is for ourselves, for Hungary, and for the cause of liberty, that adhering to our wise Pacific system and avoiding distant wars of Europe, We should keep our lamp burning rightly on this western shore as a light to all nations, than to hazard its utter extinction amid the ruins of fallen republics in Europe, close quote. Tonight, we welcome Kentucky Congressman Tom Massie, who is carrying Senator Clay's neutrality torch in opposing U.S. co-belligerency in Ukraine. You may recall that the committee gave Congressman Walter Jones, our Defender of Liberty Ward, for his courageous efforts to restore the war power of Congress. Walter chose Tom Massie to give his eulogy on the House floor. I ask you to join me in welcoming Tom Massie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'm going to say tonight wouldn't qualify you for a PhD dissertation at any university in foreign policy. It's only going to be interesting because I'm saying it. And 750,000 people in Kentucky sent me here to represent them. And so the views probably aren't going to be special or unique, but we'll see what you think. There have been 4 significant votes in Congress since the conflict in Ukraine started. And I am the only member of Congress who voted no on all 4 of those. And then there's been another one on NATO. If we have time to talk about it, I was a no on that as well. And so I want to go through these votes, some of these votes, and explain why I got to where I got to and why it's so dangerous, these votes that we're taking in Congress. And some of, maybe I'll get a chance to talk about some of the ridiculous things that my colleagues have done to get around the War Powers Act. So I'll just primarily talk about these votes, the sanctions, and why they're not a good idea, and then also why we should stay out of Ukraine. But war powers are, as John was saying, are extremely important, and they belong to Congress exclusively. You can't delegate these to other branches. We can't delegate them through treaties, but everybody thinks they've found a loophole somewhere. And one of the most interesting loopholes that one of my colleagues tried to exploit, and I've just got to tell you about this, was in a GOP conference. This would be one of those smoke-filled rooms because John Boehner was there. And he had enough smoke to fill up a room with 200 people in it. But in one of these smoke-filled rooms in the basement of the Capitol Visitor Center, you know, every Monday or Tuesday, if we came in on a Tuesday, we would have the conference meetings. And there was this discussion about Obama and Iran at the time, and should we go to war with Iran, and what should we do about them? They're obtaining nuclear weapons. And one of my colleagues stood up and came to the microphone, like some of you might tonight when we have questions, and he came to the microphone and he suggested to get around this constitutional problem, you know, that we had a guy in the White House who might not go to war, might not be inclined to war, Obama, but that we were inclined to war, and we wouldn't want anything to stop him. We certainly wouldn't want to get in Obama's way. He suggested the entire GOP conference that we pre-declare war with Iran, not for any reason, just in case Obama found a reason. Then he wouldn't have to come stop and get his ticket from us to go to war with Iran. It would already be pre-declared. And it was somewhat ridiculous, but these are the extents that people go to try. Even members of Congress who hold this power, they go to give up their power. A lot of them don't even want to vote on it. Like in 2013, if you remember, Obama came to Congress and said, we need to go to war in Syria. We're going to put boots on the ground in Syria. But I'm going to get Congress to vote on it. And Boehner said, we'll vote for that. And Pelosi said, we'll vote for that. And the American public rejected that. This is the one time, the one rare time where I think Congress was effective, and it was actually the people speaking through Congress. But do you know that vote never happened, whether to go to war in Syria? Because what happened is the support for it eroded in Congress very quickly because the people's support wasn't there. And we never did go to war in 2013 because of that. And, you know, now, We did some special things that the New York Times can tell you about, but I can't. We might have undertaken a $1 billion a year endeavor, according to the New York Times, in Syria to arm the peaceful, moderate jihadists, right? Just like right now we're supposed to be arming the peaceful, moderate Nazis. There's several parallels here. They take people that they vilified for decades and then turn around and say, well, these are different flavor. This is altogether different than what we've been talking about heretofore. And so we should get at this business. Let me start out with NATO. And NATO in its current formation, there might be a formation that doesn't apply for what I'm about to say, but in its current formation and the way it was initially conceived, it's obsolete. It became obsolete when the Soviet Union fell. It was a check on the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we either should have dissolved NATO, reconstituted it as something else, or just gotten the hell out of it as the United States. You know, the Europeans could feel like they needed to keep some kind of union, but of course they've already established one of those now too. But our role there was done. You know, President Trump said that, I agreed with him on this. He said that Europe should pay its fair share of NATO, right? It should pay its fair share of its defense. Well, what's the fair share that the United States should pay for Europe's defense? I think the fair share is zero. They should pay, I mean, they're prosperous countries. They're far more socialist than us, although we're veering in that direction. They've got plenty of money to fund all these government programs that we don't even have here. And yet we're supposed to be told that the American taxpayer should be conscripted. Just as if you would conscript somebody into the military and send them to war, we should be conscripted economically into their wars, that we should be conscripted into paying for their defense. And, you know, NATO, continuing with NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think, you know, I'm not going to tonight blame anybody but Putin for what's going on there, but we had something to do with it. We created these conditions under which what has happened has happened. And it was because we kept pursuing the expansion of NATO in Europe. We kept trying to add more countries. We kept trying to increase the budget, increase the scope of what it should be doing. By the way, this is one of the votes I voted no on here recently. My colleagues in Congress want to turn NATO into an NGO. That we had a vote on whether within NATO they should establish a program to promote democracy, as if that's what NATO should be doing. But by continuing to expand its scope, its geographic scope, and also what it endeavors to do, we've sort of, you know, put Putin up against the wall here, where his pride was at stake. And now I'm not blaming us. I'm just saying we could have done things differently than we have. But this is where we are. And I think, and this is not a widely held belief in Congress, I think we should get out of NATO. Let the Europeans provide for their own defense. And we certainly shouldn't expand what it does. By the way, you know, NATO is a Cold War relic, but so is Putin. What did Russia do to respond to us perpetuating a Cold War relic? They elected a Cold War relic of the KGB. Oh, okay, well, they're going to carry on with the Cold War. Let's do the same. Let's elect a guy who was part of this. He knows how this works. This is the kind of guy we need, because NATO still exists and there's still an existential threat to us. I mean, they wouldn't have elected him if there weren't some feeling of that among the Russian people. So there's another aspect of NATO that I want to talk about here tonight, and Bruce Fine helped illuminate this to me, put a point on it. You know, this gets into is there a loophole around the congressional war powers? Is there some way we could go to war or get involved in a war irreversibly without an act of Congress? Well, there are lots of ways to do it. There just aren't any constitutional ways to do it. And everybody's always going around, Article 5 of NATO. You can't turn on Fox without hearing about Article 5 NATO. You know, it obligates every member nation to respond with force to an attack on any other member nation. Well, it's Article 5 because there are other articles. It's not the only article. And Article 11 says that the provisions of all the articles that precede Article 11 have to be carried out in accordance with the Constitution of the respective member states. It's like, you know, Article 5 of NATO is not some loophole. If it were, it would be unconstitutional. It would have been unconstitutional to join the treaty. And the people who crafted all this at the time recognized that. And they didn't want it all to fall apart under some legal argument, so they had to put Article 11 in there, which says any provisions here have to be carried out under the, within accordance of the constitutions of the respective signees to the treaty. So there's no loophole there. A lot of people think there are, but that's because they haven't actually read the treaty itself. Speaking of treaties or documents, let's talk about the Budapest Memorandum. Has anybody heard about the Budapest Memorandum? Okay, it's written on a napkin somewhere. I haven't found the napkin. I went and looked at all of the treaties that the Senate has affirmed with a vote. It wasn't on that list. And then there's a list at the State Department of treaties that are waiting for the Senate to approve them. It wasn't on that list. And then there's this list I didn't even know existed. They created a new list starting in the 60s or something. They decided that the executive branch and the State Department could enter into treaties without the Senate. And so they've been keeping a list of these sort of pseudo treaties. So surely it must be in this 400 or 500 page document. So I looked through the whole thing. The Budapest Memorandum is not even in the list of fake treaties that the State Department keeps. And then if you do look at what it says, it doesn't obligate any nation to the defense of Ukraine. It doesn't say that in there. Like, even though it's not legally binding, it would be constitutionally abhorrent, even though it's got all those problems, if you even read the thing, it doesn't say anybody is obligated to the defense. In fact, there's one provision in there that says you're obligated to respect Ukraine's independence. And we may have violated that one in 2013 and 2014 when we helped orchestrate the overthrow of their government there. Was it a Putin-friendly government? Yeah, it was a lot more friendly than the one now, but now we have a a Western-friendly government in there. And again, this gets to where there are things we could have done differently, and we didn't. But the Budapest Memorandum doesn't obligate anybody to anything. It basically said if they give up their nuclear weapons, we won't attack them with nuclear weapons. It was about that much. And then there's one other loophole that I want to talk about that people think exists, which is the War Powers Resolution of 1973. But again, they haven't read it. And as Bruce has encouraged me to read it and pointed at certain places and highlighted it and dog-eared it and handed it to me, I found certain things in there, like Section 1547, Title 50 of U.S. Code, Section 1547, and this is in the text of the War Powers Resolution, which is there. It states that no treaty before 1973 or after 1973 can obligate the United States to war. It's plain as day right there. And it's in U.S. Code. Title 50, Section 1547. Go check it out. So those are some of the loopholes that my members have, or my colleagues have found, or think they've found, or the news pundits think they've found, and they keep telling you. I mean, I've been shocked. Members of Congress come up to me and say, but aren't we obligated on the floor of the House, not at a restaurant or something, right? We're debating the weighty issues of the day. By the way, I was late here today because we had to establish a committee to do a study on fishing and and how grants might be issued to promote fishing and stuff, the weighty issues of the day. But I was on the floor discussing an actual weighty issue of the day, which is some of the response in Congress to the conflict in Ukraine. And one of my otherwise very constitutionally literate colleagues came up to me and says, but I just feel like we're obligated under the Budapest Memorandum. And I'm like, did you read it? No. Well, here, let me give you a copy of it. Anyways, so let me, and by the way, John mentioned Henry Clay being from Kentucky and being great. And all we hear from in Kentucky is how great Henry Clay was, right? I had to get elected to Congress and to learn this history from another member of Congress about Henry Clay. Do you know, there's twice in the nation's history where the U.S. House has determined the outcome of a presidential election. The first was Jefferson's election where there was a tie. You have to get a majority. You can't just have a plurality of votes. And so, according to the Constitution, and if you get to a situation where nobody wins a clear majority, it goes to the House of Representatives. Well, that happened in 1820. Bruce, am I right? Was it 1824? Okay. In 1824 or 1820, I'm not sure, but I trust Bruce more than me. He's got a photographic memory. Nobody got a majority. And so there were two people vying for it, were the two leaders, John Quincy Adams and who was the curmudgeon? Yeah, Jackson. Okay. And Henry Clay was Speaker of the House. And so, he decided that John Quincy Adams should win. And, rumor has it that he used his weight as Speaker of the House. And let me tell you, the Speaker of the House does have a lot of influence. They determine what committees you get on, whether your bills come to the floor, if funding goes to your state. And the allegation was that Henry Clay used that influence to make sure John Quincy Adams won. Well, what's the proof of that? Well, do we have any real proof? I don't know. But what did John Quincy Adams do shortly thereafter? He made Henry Clay the Secretary of State. So Henry Clay went from Speaker of the House to Secretary of State. They do not teach this in Kentucky school books because it's known as the corrupt bargain. And so even back then, there were deals being cut for who's going to become president if it goes to the House of Representatives. And hopefully it doesn't go to the House of Representatives. Hopefully the states can decide this going forward. A little bit about the danger of giving, and I'm sure Bruce and John can speak to this more, but the danger of providing military assistance to Ukraine. As John mentioned, we've claimed that people who provide assistance to terrorists are co-belligerents if they're against the United States. And just by merely providing that assistance, the question is the assistance that we're providing, the defensive assistance, does that make us, or the information assistance, does that make us a co-belligerent? I'm not going to litigate that from this podium, but I will tell you what Poland thinks. You remember there was all this discussion about, well, Poland can just give, the Ukrainians need more MiGs, more jets, and Poland has the kind of jets they know how to fly. So the sort of the collective thought in the media was, well, Poland will just give them some jets, loan them some jets, and we'll just pay them back. Well, at first, Poland didn't do this, and so there was some discussion. Well, maybe we need to give Poland some jets. Maybe the United States needs to give Poland some jets so they can give their jets to Ukraine, because we don't want them to be without jets. And there's a long line of people who want jets from the United States, and Poland somewhere down that line, but let's let them skip line and let's take care of this problem. Well, it turns out that wasn't the problem, was it? Poland was, this is like, in high school. By the way, I married my high school sweetheart, but she's the first sweetheart I had, but she's not the first girl I asked out. That one rejected me 3 times in different ways until I realized she didn't want to go out with me. You know, she had a hair appointment that day, you know, had a family reunion the next weekend. There was always something. Well, with Poland, there was always something. And what it turns out when you find out the real reason is they agreed to do it if we would take their MiGs and then if we would give the MiGs to Ukraine. Why did they want that kind of structure? Because they don't want to be co-belligerents. They're right there next to it. And so that's my opinion of why they turned it down and decided not to do it. Let me talk about the sanctions and why. Well, let me cover the easy votes first. There was a vote on whether we should, you know, a resolution in Congress. A lot of these are non-binding. We don't really do anything. They're just words. But they can lead to things. They give the imprimatur of Congress. And then maybe later they're substituted by the executive branch to say, well, you know, they didn't really vote on it, but we found this resolution where this is what they really wanted. So we went ahead and did it. One of the resolutions that we voted on was whether to, and it's really the whereas clauses that get me a lot of times. If they just said what they wanted to do, the now therefore be it resolved part, I don't have as much problem with sometimes as I do the whereas clauses where everybody gets their licks in. You got to declare somebody's a dictator and they've violated this and they've done that and they're a horrible person and they don't deserve to breathe air or eat food or sleep in a bed. And so in one of these things, the resolution was to adamantly and vociferously encourage the global community to investigate the war crimes that have been going on. And that's sort of the assumption in the resolution, is that they are going on. And so if you vote for it, you're not really voting for an investigation. You're voting to say, yeah, I think these are war crimes, and that's a war criminal. And when this is all over, he should meet the same fate as Colonel Gaddafi, and Saddam Hussein. Well, what if we back Putin into that corner? I mean, Saddam Hussein and Colonel Gaddafi did not have nuclear weapons. They were waging wars that have gone on since the 12th century with high-powered rifles. And yeah, they had accumulated some nasty weapons, but they didn't have nuclear weapons and they didn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles, and Putin does. So what if you convince a guy that when this is all over, no matter how it turns out, if he ain't running the world, he is going to rot in prison or die? Probably not a good idea to reach a good outcome here with a guy that's got nuclear weapons. So why, back home in Kentucky, some of these votes at first are hard to explain. I don't make excuses for my votes. I give reasons for my votes. There's a difference. But back home, people, you look for simpler messages. They don't give you as much time as you're graciously giving me tonight to explain these votes. It's like 15 seconds. Tell us why you voted against little puppies and apple pie. So my 15-second one on this would be, look, if there's a 5% chance that this turns into a nuclear conflagration, if Ukraine metastasizes into a global war that involves nuclear weapons, if there's a 5% chance of that, and I can vote to reduce that to 2% chance, that's the vote I'm going to take. That's the vote I owe 750,000 people in Kentucky. Not the vote that, where you thump your chest and it makes you feel good and you can get on Fox and say, yeah, we need to do something about this dictator. So that's the vote I'm going to take, and may not be the most exciting vote, and it's oftentimes a hard vote to stand behind. Let me talk a little bit about the sanctions and why I voted against sanctions. One of the sanctions votes was fairly easy to vote against. It was an expansion and a perpetual, continuation forever of the Magnitsky Act, which started out kind of small. It was, you know, it was supposed to be targeting a few thugs that did something bad. But now it covers anybody in the world, you know, outside the United States that the president decides is violating human rights. But Senator Rand Paul, who's great on this, Henry Clay is not my favorite Kentuckian. Senator Rand Paul is in politics. You know, he's been great on this. Senator Paul has, and but this is, I kind of lost my train of thought. What was I talking about, Bruce?
You're talking about how we expanded the global Magnitsky.
Oh yeah, the Magnitsky Act. Yeah. So it includes everybody, and Senator Paul pushed back because they were going to let the president define what, you know, violation of human rights were. Whereas there's kind of a list of suggestions of what might be human rights violations. They were going to take those suggestions out and then extend it indefinitely. Well, Senator Paul was able to get them to roll back the broadening of allowing the executive branch to define what human rights violations were, but they still made it go on forever. Why would anybody in Congress vote to give what has now devolved into the most powerful branch of government more power, which is what that does? It gives the president, not just President Biden, but any president after that, the power to declare anybody outside of the United States to be in this category and to sanction them. And by the way, what is a sanction? What is a sanction? Okay, is a sanction, does it create a crime? Does it make it a crime for somebody in Russia to buy something from an American salesperson? No, it doesn't. It doesn't create it does create that crime, but who gets prosecuted? The American, not the person in Russia. They're outside of our jurisdiction. When you put more sanctions on the books, you are creating federal crimes for Americans that you can now violate. This is the step that a lot of my colleagues haven't realized. We're just creating more federal crimes, and which I'm against. We have all these crimes now of conspiracy, where if you just think about doing it or you talk about doing it, now you've committed the crime. And so it's not going to be long before they have like conspiracy to provide Netflix to a Russian somewhere, you know, and you'll be convicted of that. But the first vote that we had on a sanction resolution was I actually came up with like 6 reasons to vote against it. I may come up with more while I'm standing here. It called for an open-ended, this was the first Ukraine vote, it called for an open-ended, additional and immediate defensive security assistance to Ukraine. It didn't say we're not going to put boots on the ground. It was so broad in scope, the first claim in what was supposed to be just a resolution, like a sanctions resolution, said that we would provide this immediate defensive security assistance without bounding that or qualifying that in any way. Why didn't they qualify it in any way? Because to get what they would hope would be a unanimous vote, there were 3 of us didn't vote for it, but what they did to hopefully get a unanimous vote was to placate the people in Congress who want boots on the ground. It's not, the wording of these things is not accidental. If you look at it and say, wait, this could allow that. Of course it could allow that. That's why it's written that way. So it could allow boots on the ground. The second thing is it expanded the geographic scope. Remember, this was in the first few days of when the Russian army invaded Ukraine. They came through Belarus. Well, the sanctions, they called for expanding it to the geographic scope to Belarus by condemning the country of Belarus and their leader of Belarus. Okay, so let's just start expanding the scope of this as soon as we can, even though we haven't, our job is to constrain it. Called for fully isolating Russia economically. How do you fully and completely isolate Russia economically without hurting American consumers? I can tell you Germany ain't for this. Like, the lights would go off in Germany if you actually fully sanctioned Russia. The first thing I did was I went and looked at like our Commerce Department, the top 10 imports from Russia into the United States. And what I was shocked at is it's not like China where we buy computers and things that are assembled and furniture and everything you can imagine. We buy raw materials from Russia for the most part, and then we make something out of them. One of the biggest raw materials we buy from Russia is fertilizer. Don't forget, I represent 750,000 people in Kentucky, and a lot of them are already short on fertilizer right now. $1 billion of fertilizer from Russia. So if we fully isolate Russia, it's going to hurt us here. It's going to add to the inflation and shortages. I think the crippling sanctions could drive Putin to be more desperate, such as escalating the types of weapons being used. And then it contained a gratuitous statement on NATO and Ukraine. It says that Ukraine and NATO will determine the relationship between the two of them. Of course they will. That's always been the case, and it will always be the case. But why do you have to put it in here unless you're just trying to needle somebody? And so that was in here too. And then it says it calls for continuing support as long as the Russian Federation continues to violate Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, what does violate mean? This is one of those phrases that gets you there forever. Somebody has to declare they're no longer violating their sovereignty. Have we violated their sovereignty by having our State Department over there and the people that are supposed to be NGOs doing things? I don't know. Well, I want to wrap it up and leave time for questions. I didn't think I could go on for as long as I did about this, but there were 4 votes on Ukraine. There was 1 on NATO. I've been no on all of them. I wish there were more no's. We've had some of these. The NATO vote got no. It was one of the votes I haven't explained to you tonight fully was about the war crimes. A lot of I was surprised to find some of my colleagues who serve in the military. They're officers in the military. Were voting against the war crimes resolution. And I went up to them and I'm like, well, why are you, you'd think they might be more inclined toward supporting Ukraine. They've got a military background. They made a career in the military. You'd think they'd be rah, rah, rah. And I'm like, why are you voting against the war crimes against Putin? I thought you'd be a yes on this. They said, well, this opens up a whole Pandora's box in Afghanistan. Like, if we don't have a double standard here, what are soldiers from the United States going to be convicted of war crimes? When you accidentally drone a wedding party, is that a war crime? Was it accidental or not? Do you have to prove it was? Is it okay if it's an accident? Wait, what is the criteria? And so I was very encouraged that there were like at least 60 no's on that when people started thinking through it and saying, wait, if we hold this standard there and they hold us to the same standard, what's going to happen? So I'll just wrap it up and say thank you for having me here tonight. Again, nothing I've said is extraordinary or remarkable. It wouldn't get you a PhD or even a master's dissertation on foreign policy. Wouldn't even qualify as a sentence in that. But the fact that somebody who represents 750,000 people in Kentucky is saying it, I guess makes it interesting. Thank you. By the way, I've been in a car for 9 hours. I just got here like 10 minutes before they closed that vote on the fisheries and then came over here. So, thank you. Well, I'm just saying I need a little glass of wine here.
Salute. Thank you very much for being here this evening. I think it's pretty clear that Putin is trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together. And then maybe add on a few pieces to it. To what extent should the Western countries, including democracies or otherwise, stand by while Putin undertakes this task of rebuilding Humpty Dumpty or trying to rebuild it? And then I have a related question, and that has to do with Taiwan. which is an independent country, has been for a long time, more or less a democracy. If China makes a move on Taiwan, what should be the posture of the United States? Just stand by and let China take it over?
I don't know that I'm qualified or informed enough to say too much about Taiwan, but I would like to address the first part of your question, because I've thought about that in the context of all these votes that we've taken. I don't think it's, Putin, the national pride in Russia is definitely at stake, and certainly Putin's pride. I don't think they're under any illusion that they're going to reconstitute the Soviet Union. But my view on Ukraine, and again, it's up for Ukrainian people to decide, not for me. I want to protect our sovereignty, and I respect their sovereignty. But what would be best for the world? Would it be best to have the European Union bordering immediately on what was the Soviet Union? I know Ukraine was in there, but what is Russia now? It seems like to have a country which is not a member of the European Union or the old Soviet Union would be the best thing for everybody if there was a buffer zone there. And there's a lot of diversity in that country. I believe that if you don't respect that wide array of diversity, then it's going to have to become fragmented, and some part of it go to the old Soviet Union and some part of it come to the new European Union. But I don't think it should be a custody battle. I think that's part of the problem here. This has been a custody battle for Ukraine. And which, are they going to be a satellite of Europe or a satellite of Russia? By the way, just a quick story from back in Kentucky. Obviously, Putin is suffering losses. And I believe, but I can't know for certain, that he didn't anticipate these kind of losses. That he thought he could roll in and they would just, throw up their hands and it would be over with. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen, and was this a move that he will regret or not? I think he may have already calculated this possibility, and he may not regret losing, when it's all over, maybe 20% of his troops and his equipment in this war. Let me explain my personal intuition. It comes from a guy in Kentucky who worked for me. He was an alcoholic. He would be homeless, but he always found somebody's home to stay in, and he helped me build my house. So I would go find him every morning, and he usually had a warrant out for him. And so it was hard to find him in town, but I would drive around until he popped out from behind a corner and get in the car, and we'd go, and he'd help me build my house. And one day I picked him up. It looked like a truck had run over him. He had what I believe were broken ribs, a black eye, and he just looked horrible. And I offered to take him back home. I offered to take him to the hospital. And he said, no, I'll work. And I said, what happened to you? His name was Stid, S-T-I-D, which was a short version of his last name. And I said, Stid, what happened to you? He said, well, yesterday when I was working for you, Brian, that was the guy he lived with, found my whiskey and drank it all. It was under my mattress. He drank all my whiskey. Now, Stid was 120 pounds wet, and Brian is like 300 pounds and 6 inches taller than Stid. And I said, Stid, if you weren't there when he stole the whiskey, why do you look like this? And he always called me Head for some reason. He said, Head, if somebody steals my whiskey, somebody's taking an ass whipping. And I don't care if it's got to be me. And this was also the reason he had a warrant out for him. It was his warrant was $50 restitution. And, it was $200 restitution. He had been convicted. He didn't show up to the court because it was a kangaroo deal. Some people he was staying with had probably done some things, and they went and raided the house. They'd stole some copper from an air conditioner or something. And they found Stid in their house. Stid's homeless, and he's staying in their house. So they find Stid. they can't really convict him, so they find him guilty and they say $200 restitution. And it was tough finding Stid in the day, so in the morning. So I said, Stid, look, I'm paying you good money. You could pay this restitution after 2 weeks. We'd just take a little bit out. And so what I offered was a matching fund. If he would like take $100 out of his paycheck over the course of 2 weeks, I would match it and we would go down. And he found this actually more morally reprehensible because he wasn't guilty. And his whole theory was if you make it easy on them, if you make it easy for them to impugn you, they will just do it more. You will be the target if you're the easy target. So we go down to the courthouse with $200 cash, and I get ready to walk in there with Stid, and he drops behind the back seat and lays on the floor. And I said, what, aren't you going to go in? We get to like buy your freedom. You won't have to hide anymore. He's like, no, Head, they charge you $50 to arrest you. And if I walk in there with you, they'll charge us $250. But if you go in there alone, it's $200. I said, that's a load of crock. So I go in, and the clerk pulls out his paperwork, and she says, okay, that's $250. And I said, I thought his restitution was $200. She said, did Bill Lewis arrest him yet? That was the sheriff. I said, no. And she says, all right, it's just $200. But anyway, Stid knew all the ins and outs of this. But his point, the reason I told you this story is, you know, to some degree, Putin's taken an ass whipping here. But the national pride is at stake. And if at some point he didn't take an ass whipping, you know, he feels, I'm not supporting or arguing for his logic, but I think if you're trying to get in his head, he feels like at some point he had to fight back. Now we got to avoid a situation where he feels like he has nothing to lose. Because when you can, you know, don't get in a fight with somebody in prison who's on death row. They got nothing to lose, right?
Well, Putin is really a classic example of a guy riding a tiger. If he falls off the tiger, he's dead. I mean, there are about probably 1,000 people in Russia would like to kill Putin. So he has to be president of Russia. But you said something a little bit. Or I used to live in Moscow. I was a reporter there, and but you said something a little bit earlier that really struck my curiosity. I mean, you mentioned buffer zones. Russia is obsessed with buffer zones around itself. And it had two layers during the Cold War. It had the near abroad, as they call it, you know, Belarus and the Baltic countries and Moldova and Ukraine. And then they also had the Eastern Bloc. And suddenly in 1991, they lose all of that. I mean, it would be like us starting to be afraid of Mexico or Canada. I mean, we don't think about this kind of stuff here. It's always good to look at your adversary's sort of point of view. But, you know, we have the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, Canada, Mexico. We don't think about border security until very recently have we started to think about it. But as I watched all this sort of, you know, you mentioned 2014, when the United States...
We thought about it in Cuba, and we were ready to have a nuclear war over it.
We were ready to have a nuclear war. And I think what's going on right now in the minds of a lot of Russians, at least in the minds of the policymakers, this is kind of a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. If Ukraine were to become part of NATO, you'd have you'd have Pershing missiles in Ukraine right on the Russian border, kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the minds of a lot of Russian, again, policymakers, this is how they see it. This is how they see NATO. Imagine if China and Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua were holding naval exercises in the Gulf of Mexico. We'd go insane. And we might even invade Venezuela, which we've been talking about doing for a while, some people have. You know, we would go nuts. And I think that, in a way, is how the Russians see Ukraine completely differently than we do. We see this poor country getting attacked by Russia. Russians see Ukraine as a money laundering operation. Russia's corrupt, obviously. But what happened in Russia in 2000, Putin kind of took all the organized crime, the disorganized crime maybe, and organized it under the Kremlin. And they didn't do that in Ukraine. The organized crime organizations in Ukraine kind of run the government. In Russia, the government runs the organized crime operations. So you've got, these stories have not been told in the United States. It's just the poor little Ukrainians and the bad Russians. But there's a lot more to stuff like that. It'd be interesting to hear what you had to say about, you mentioned Cuba, but it'd be interesting to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, I wasn't alive for that, but you know, as I hear you speak, it sounds very cogent and intelligent to me that you'd want to get inside the head of your enemies and find out what motivates them and what they're thinking. The problem is in Congress, when you try to do that, they say you're a tool of Putin, that you're sympathetic to Putin, merely because you're trying to understand how he thinks. Henry Kissinger said that vilifying Putin is not foreign policy. It's an alibi for the lack of one. And that's what I think a lot of people are undergoing right now. They try to out-vilify Putin. You know, somebody says, wow, he's horrible. No, he's worse than that, you know. Like, it's like a contest, but that's not foreign policy. Foreign policy is trying to, business or even Congress is trying to understand the people you're dealing with. What motivates them may not motivate you, but you need to understand what motivates them. And by the way, for saying these things, I've been called, you know, Putin's ally or Putin's puppet or Putin's friend here. Did you know Russia sanctioned, after we sanctioned like a bunch of their people, they turned around and sanctioned, I don't know, 480 members of the House and the Senate. And I got sanctioned. And so one of my very pro-Ukrainian friends in Congress sent me this and says, why did Putin sanction you? By the way, Nancy Pelosi was not sanctioned. And Kevin McCarthy was not sanctioned. And I said, because Putin knows I'm good for America, and these other bozos are bad for America. Just look at the list. Why would he sanction? Why wouldn't he sanction? Why would he not sanction me? If I'm going to make America great.
Congressman is somebody who worked on the Hill a couple of times. I must say it is very refreshing to hear somebody who works up there who's got something sensible to say and can say it lucidly. Particularly if you were in a car for 9 hours before you came back. I think you deserve another glass of red wine.
I'll have one before I leave.
I cannot not say that I'm the person who wrote 7 articles as why the United States should get the hell out of NATO, and used to be a lecturer at the NATO school in Oberammergau as to why the United States should get out of NATO, which was rated by the NATO military officers in that course as one of their favorite presentations, not because they agreed with it, but because it didn't put them to sleep. Mm-hmm. But I actually have a question. The other body up on Capitol Hill passed legislation giving Ukraine essentially Lend-Lease, in which we could give Ukraine essentially unlimited munitions and equipment and military stuff without any accountability whatsoever. And that legislation is waiting for you guys in the House of Representatives to do something about it, and I haven't heard anything. I kind of figured you guys would jump on that, you'd pass that right away, but you haven't.
Like a duck on a June bug, right?
Congressman, you're from Kentucky, I'm from Oklahoma, so I recognize the expression. Yes, but I'm sort of curious. At what point will the House of Representatives maybe hesitate? And is the House going to pass Lend-Lease for Ukraine?
So I saw that when you started to mention that. It was on my radar. It came up in an email, bills to be considered soon, possibly, when that passed the Senate. And it hasn't come to the House yet. I don't know if it's on the docket this week. Sometimes... I don't know if it was an idea. It depends on who came up with the idea. If it came from the State Department, it should. No, this was the Senate. Right. No, I know the Senate passed it. but who wrote it? If it came through the State Department, it should go through Congress like grease through a goose, right? But if some senator came up with this idea and thought it was popular back home and wrote it and then got it passed, and then the White House heard about it and said, oh, crap, this isn't what we wanted, or the State Department, then I could see them calling the leadership in the House and say, slow this thing down. We don't want this on the president's desk. This is not what we asked for. We don't want it. So I mean, I'm just trying to, I don't know if you were asking me why it might not be, why it hasn't come to the House yet. I think that was the question. Maybe there's some hesitation at the White House. I mean, they're going to be friendly to the White House in the Speaker's office. And so maybe there's something in that they don't want. And I'll be honest, I haven't thoroughly reviewed the bill yet that the Senate passed, and but I know it was supposed to be on our docket.
Congressman, the most important issue to me that you dealt with tonight, or that you raised, was the issue of red lines in co-belligerency. And from historical, in historical context, there have been many examples of a weaker power engaged in a war with an even smaller power, like a civil war, that has permitted a larger power to arm the group that they're fighting. I mean, a good example of that would be the American Civil War, for example. And Britain and France, mostly Britain, was responsible for arming the Confederacy. Britain gave 1 million Enfield rifles to the Confederacy, and the Confederacy could not have sustained its war effort without British aid. But the Union felt that it couldn't fight Britain, which was the superpower of the day. Likewise, with Roosevelt's Lend-Lease in 1940, the U.S. was arming the Kuomintang in China. Japan didn't draw a red line there. We were arming the British, and Germany did not draw a red line. But there are red lines. There are points at which even a great power, or in this case, a great power coalition, would cross those lines. And it's remarkable that given everything we've done and are doing and have promised to do for Ukraine, we haven't really crossed those, and Russia is accommodating in a way. But there are red lines, and I would like you to reflect on what those red lines might be. And I think even more important, because I haven't seen this in the discussion in the town, there should be some kind of analytical effort as to what those red lines might be. They haven't been sanctions as of yet. They haven't been advisors and aides on the ground, any number of extravagant, exotic, high-tech weapon systems. None of that has crossed the line. But it's important to know what that red line might be, and I'd like you to, if you would, reflect on what that might be, and on the idea of getting it into the public discourse, that we need to identify what that is so that we don't cross it inadvertently.
Yeah, I'm here tonight hoping, I came here hoping not to litigate or adjudicate what that red line is. Yeah, I do want to avoid saying that as soon as possible, or for as long as possible, because again, if anybody says the things I say, they may not be interesting other than the fact that I actually get to vote on this. And then it becomes important, or it's like impeachment. I'm on the committee, the Judiciary Committee, where the impeachment things originate. So I can't go out and say, oh, we should impeach so-and-so, because I'm on that committee. And so, again, it's hard to litigate these things, but let me put my toe in the water and say, I think the theater of use of the weapon, even a weapon that might not be considered to make you a co-belligerent, most certainly will if you go into Russian territory and use it, which is, I think, part of the significance of those kind of attacks. And let's say the things that are probably clearly in the category and things that probably aren't. Probably aren't anti-missile defense. If you got something to protect your city and it's going to shoot down an incoming missile, okay. Again, I'm not an expert on this. It's only because I'm elected that it's even interesting to you all. But anti-missile, but on the other side, jets. I think Poland was smart enough to know, hey, this makes us a co-belligerent. These jets can go into Russia and acquire targets there. They can shoot down things that aren't even meant to, kill Ukrainians. Information is tough. I got to believe we're supplying all kinds of information that a country the size of Ukraine could never acquire in their wildest dreams. And they're probably getting maps and daily reports and satellite images, that enable the kind of stuff that they're pulling off. Imagine if they were just on the ground trying to guess where the Russian tanks were, and they couldn't get into the air, and they don't have satellites, and they'd just be guessing. Oh, look, there's a tank. Wonder when it left Russia. Wonder when it got here. Wonder how tired these people are. Now, they've got all kinds of information, which is going to make it harder for Putin. Obviously, I don't know. Why don't you tell me what you think, where you think the line is? That would be more helpful to me.
Any line that moves in the direction of Russia losing the war. Any line that were to change the balance, because right now, frankly, Russia is in a position to bring the war to a conclusion if NATO permits it. Anything that would prevent that outcome from happening. In other words, if there was something the U.S. could do to prevent the cauldron that is currently being completed in Donbass that will result in the destruction of the primary army of Ukraine, the regular army, if we were to somehow find a way to stop that. And that's why I think you're seeing increasing desperation in Western capitals, especially in London and Washington, to find ways of intervening that would stop that. And so if it seems as though Russia is about to pull off a victory in Donbass, which would be in many ways a strategic outcome to the war, because the Ukrainian army would be destroyed. And of course, the Russians are conducting a nationwide anti-infrastructure campaign that's reducing the capacity of Ukraine to fight. If we wanted to stop that and found a way to stop that, that might be a red line.
Which is interesting. The war didn't start out that way. I was surprised. For weeks, we were watching people that had electricity and telephone service and water, like for at least a week or two in the beginning, which if this were all-out war, that'd be the first thing you would target, I would think. Of course, he was, I think, holding out hope that maybe they just roll over and he could acquire the infrastructure. But I think you're right. Maybe, I don't know, I hate to repeat your words because then they'll be in a newspaper and I said them. You said something like charitable or something, Putin's interpretation of what would make us a co-belligerent, whatever you said. I think Putin recognizes he doesn't get to write the rules of engagement, but okay, I think he's resigned to, okay, if these are the rules of engagement, if the Ukrainians can have all the Javelin missiles they want, if the Ukrainians can have every access to all the satellite imagery, then it's going to be a war of attrition and we'll lose a lot more people in the process, but we'll still win. And so that defines the kind of war, I think is what you were getting at, that Putin's going to wage. Is it going to be an infrastructure? Is it going to degrade their infrastructure? Is he going to, is it going to be just a ground war of attrition? What's it going to be? He doesn't really get to write those rules of engagement. Those are just, I think, the international community and people. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, okay, there's more overhead here because of this, but we're going to accomplish this outcome, is his thinking, I think. And I think the outcome is not going to be too far off of his original request, other than the degradation or complete annihilation of military equipment on both sides. The result's going to be sort of, I think, what he was asking for in the beginning, which is the two areas in eastern Ukraine. His request was that they be neutral. His definition of that probably means they have pro-Putin, leaders, but it's not going to be too far off from that. And that's what I guess.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to follow up on the question. So I have an actual practical question. So what happens if Russia deliberately hits a convoy of weapons being shipped in Poland, and NATO invokes Article 5? What does Congress do at that point? Because I guess we're circling back to the beginning of your remarks.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what happens, and are you prepared to lead some sort of resistance to any motion to involve the United States in a fighting war with Russia at that point via NATO?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the danger of being redundant, the NATO treaty doesn't obligate us to war, and the president doesn't have the pre-authorization to strike a nuclear country, or frankly any country. It doesn't matter how big you are. The law doesn't change based on the size of the country or the weapons that they possess. But there was, if you think back to when Trump struck Soleimani, killed Soleimani there in Iraq. It wasn't on Iranian soil, but there was an attack there in the theater where maybe there was the authorization to do that. We had a vote in Congress, and it's initially the whereas clauses. Again, the things that sort of trip me up a lot of times, they had a litigation of whether Trump should have killed Soleimani or not. And Matt Gaetz went to the Democrats and said, if you take the litigating out of the whereas clauses, I'll vote for the resolved clause, which is the president can't go to war with Iran without a vote of Congress. And there were three Republicans. Ultimately, the Democrats that day found the Constitution, found where the war powers really resided, and they voted, all of them unanimously, for that, to say that the president doesn't have the authorization to go to war without an act of Congress. I hope, and then there were 3 Republicans. And Trump called me up that day. It was in January. And it was interesting, the logic he gave me on why I should vote for this. By the way, he starts out, I'm more anti-war than you are. Like somebody told him, they were probably prepped him, and I thanked him. I said, you're the first president since I could vote for presidents who hasn't actually started a war of some kind. And yeah, you're right, And so I thanked him for all of those things, but I told him that I had to vote for this. I mean, because I voted for the same sort of things when Obama was president. I said, I'm just going to be consistent. And he says, well, I think we should stick together. And then he made this argument. I mean, at least he tried some logic on me. He said, if you give me the authority to do this, I can threaten them with a bigger threat and keep us out of a war. And if they have the threat of me attacking them, that will keep them from escalating. And I said, well, that works great until they call your bluff, and then we've already given you basically the authority to go to war. And his answer to that, well, you're going to get a primary this cycle. and I can't help you if that happens. And the next day, I got a primary. But I think that was going to happen anyway. I think he just people were feeding him information so he could be the prophet of doom, and tell me this was going to. And I said, hey, if the worst thing that happens to me is I have to go back to my farm in Kentucky, I'll take it. But Yes, I would, I mean, I've teamed up with people on the other side of the aisle to do these sort of things, to try and bring a quicker end to the war in Afghanistan. Even though the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional, it has expedited parliamentary, a lot of times you get bogged down and, the Speaker has the Rules Committee and bills die in committee and resolutions die. Well, the War Powers Resolution in 1973 at least has some expedited methods of getting to the floor quicker. And I have teamed up with the other side of the aisle to do that. The question is, who would you find on the other side of the aisle? And if we're in the minority, but I'm always in the minority, regardless of which party's in the majority, who's going to bring it, how are we going to force it to the floor? But the War Powers Resolution of 1973 gives you the ability to force it out of committee within like 3 days. So I would try anything that we could do parliamentary-wise and legally.
Yeah.
Bruce. I thought Bruce was going to ask the first question. He's been very patient here.
Just some initial observations. The British never recognized the Confederacy, and they had to pay damages in the Alabama Claims Commission decision after the Civil War because they had illegally armed the South with a warship that they had built in a British port.
That was about the raiders, not about the guns.
Well, they had to pay. That was a violation of neutrality, and they had to pay for it. A second observation, Lend-Lease followed 3 neutrality acts passed by Congress, but at least it was enacted by Congress to create the supply of arms to those who are under attack. Here, we have a situation where Congress has not amended any statute, to make us a co-belligerent with Ukraine. It's all been unilateral decisions of the president, and Congress kind of cheerleads, as you say, they pass meaningless, non-binding resolutions. But I want to ask this question. In 2014, Soviet Russia annexed Crimea by force. It still has annexed Crimea, and de facto it is recognized the Donbass area as part of Russia. It seems to me difficult to argue that if the case for becoming a belligerent with Ukraine is because if Ukraine goes under, that's the end of democracy. Why wouldn't that also mean, well, we've got to attack Russia because they still have annexed Crimea? We've done nothing. They've annexed the Donbass region. We've done nothing. They crushed years earlier Grozny and Chechnya. We didn't do anything. They have de facto occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which was part of Georgia. Maybe they don't call them part of the Russia, but every bit as much as they're controlled by Putin, every bit as much as if he were the authority, and also part of Moldavia. So when you get into this game of, if one country's attacked or there's any annexation, we need to be the first there because otherwise it's the first step, like Munich, towards the whole destruction of the world. I think it gets us into war in a lot of places that would be very dangerous, to say the least. The last observation, I'd like you to comment on this. This is...
Let me comment on that real quick.
Yeah.
So I write computer code, and I think I'm the first congressman who has an app at the App Store. I'm not going to tell you what it is. But one of the expressions in computer syntax is if this, then that. And I disagree with the if statement, the conditional if, which is if Ukraine loses, it's the end of democracy. No, it's not. But obviously you know that.
Yeah, correct. I think it's a variation, in my view, of the domino theory. Somehow, if we lost Vietnam, all of the world would become communist. Obviously,
Zelensky is not
true.
Thomas Jefferson.
No, that's for sure. And Ukraine is not the American colonists and risking their lives, fortune, and sacred honor for government by the consent of the governed and the various other grievances identified in the Declaration of Independence. But going back to the question previously about, well, how would Congress react if there was an attack on a NATO member? At least then the constitutional issue is, presented to Congress, how are you going to react? And I think that, I mean, my view is, no, we shouldn't be going to war there. They're not at all essential to our national security. I don't believe in a domino theory. But historically, Congress has voted to go to war in only 5 conflicts in over 230-some years. And those conflicts were situations where the Congress concluded we were already in a state of war because we had been attacked. Now, some of them were based upon faulty understandings because presidents lied, like President Polk in the Mexican-American War. But you have the sense of the congressional cowardice, if you will, of being accountable for anything. If there came a time where Russia did attack a NATO member and it came to the floor in the House, are we going to declare war or not? How do you think the House would vote?
I think they would, if history is any indicator, they would probably vote on something that's not called war, but it would be a very popular vote, and the media would gin it up in the hours and days leading up to the vote, and the pressure would build on anybody who dared to defy that vote. They'd be threatened by their party leadership. They'd be humiliated in their hometown media. And it still wouldn't even be an actual war vote. But I think that's what would happen. I think the appetite, if it weren't there initially, would eventually get there. Syria was different. So the exception to what I'm telling you is what I started out with, which was in 2013, in July, around August, they were going to. It was July, but there was all this hubbub before the August recess, and when we came back, they had all forgotten that we were even going to vote on it. It just went away because the appetite wasn't there. And then they waged a secret version of it, according to the New York Times.
The executive branch did.
Yes, the executive branch did. But the Intel Committee, there are secret budgets. And, I mean, the funding, Congress still has the power of the purse. It's not like the executive branch was able to, reappropriate $1 billion to undertake this. There are people in Congress who know, and so the executive branch can always come back and say, we notified Congress. Okay, well, you notified like 4 people, maybe 8. And who were handpicked for those positions, so they wouldn't notify the rest of Congress. So if the public support is there, by the way, I'm done blaming my colleagues. I did that the first 5-6 years I was in Congress. I blame the people that elected them now. Like, this is why I support term limits. I'll vote for it, but when you throw our set of clowns out, who's going to pick the new set of clowns? The same people that picked the old ones. Like, I do think that I want, you and I especially, want to implicate my colleagues, but, and you may have been the one that gave me this term, the problem is most of them committed perjury when they swore an oath to the Constitution, right? So we want to implicate them because they're clearly violating the Constitution, whether they don't vote at all because they think this NATO treaty, allows the president to do it. Whether it's an act of omission or commission, we believe they're violating the Constitution. But they've been elected by people who want them to do that. They just don't have the fiber to do the right thing, but they're doing the thing that the people want them to do. So I think the outcome will be whatever this sentiment can, however much sentiment can be ginned up in the media. Because my colleagues, some of them are craven and conniving and, and plotting and whatever, but mostly they're just scared and they're going to do take the easiest path that day. Have any of you seen this House of Cards on Netflix? Like, I started watching that when I got elected to Congress. It came out right about the time I got elected. And by the second episode, there was some congressman doing cocaine in a trailer park to get some dirt on another congressman. I'm like, that would never happen. I'm not going to watch this show. And then one of my colleagues got busted buying cocaine at Union Station. Like, one of the 4 people I hung out with the most the first, year. And I'm like, well, I got to go back and watch this show. Maybe it's a how-to manual. So I started watching House of Cards again, and I noticed the chair rail looked just like in my office. The lampshades were the same, everything. It's like they had recreated my office in their studio. And so I was like, wow, this is so real. And then after 2 or 3 episodes more, I realized they missed one detail completely that ruins the show for me. I can't ever watch it because they got this detail so wrong. In House of Cards, there's a guy with a plan. There's nobody with a plan over there. And by the way, I introduced you, the lady asked, would I push back? I was pushing back on Syria in 2013, but I didn't think it was going to come to a vote. And I introduced something called the War Powers Restoration Act, which basically, it was the name sounded really good, but it basically just said you can't fund military, paramilitary. Like, I tried to cover all the things they might do in Syria without a vote of Congress. You just can't do it. So, I introduced that bill and got 5 or 6 co-sponsors. But then I offered a version of it on the appropriations bill. Actually, Ted Yoho did the same thing, so we actually ended up voting on his. And I offered one very similar, because if you remember, Egypt was undergoing in 2013. They had just gone through a coup, and we just keep shipping them arms and stuff, like it's the same people in charge, nothing going on here, none of our foreign aid changes. It's just like, just a coup, minor coup. Military took over or whatever, just keep sending them all the stuff. So I offered an amendment on the appropriations bill. Congress has really gone downhill in just the 9 years that I've been here. I gave John Boehner a hard time earlier, but we used to have open rules on appropriations bills, which meant you could offer a limitation amendment on any spending bill as long as it was germane to the bill. So and all of these amendments had the form of, none of the money hereby appropriated can be used for X, okay? If it was a NASA bill, you could say, none of the money hereby appropriated can be used for this boondoggle rocket program in Alabama, okay? You could offer an amendment like that, and you would get a vote. If you pressed it, if you said, I want to vote on this, then they would give you a vote, and you could get a sense of Congress, even though that appropriations bill was eventually going to be thrown in the trash, and we were going to do an omnibus bill anyway. And even if the appropriations bill, we were doing that process, they'd probably kill it in conference. At least you had a vote on something. And so I offered this, the defund thing as a limitation amendment on an appropriations bill in 2013. And some staffer, not another member of Congress, some staffer came to me and said, let this go by a voice vote. And I said, what do you mean? And I was green, I was fresh, I've been here 8 months. Let it go by a voice vote. And I'm like, no, I'm going to demand a recorded vote. He's like, no, we're going to let it pass. And I said, well, why can't we get why can't we get a recorded vote? He said, because the State Department and AIPAC are telling us not to. They don't want to vote on whether money should go to Egypt or not. They do not want Congress to weigh in on it whatsoever. The State Department didn't want a sense of Congress, and AIPAC didn't want a sense of Congress. And this staffer was telling me, these are the people who are telling Congress not to vote on my amendment. And I'm like, so if I don't call for a vote, it passes? And he said, yeah. So I didn't call for a vote. And they let it pass on a voice vote. And for 5 glorious hours, I felt like a victory. And then I realized I had been robbed. And so I've demanded a recorded vote ever since. It was always their intention to strip that out. You could just say, this is just one crazy member of Congress, instead of getting, 60, 100, 200 votes for it, they could just say, just one crazy member of Congress, we let it go, we just stripped it out, it's nothing, don't worry about this. It's a State Department, we're still in control. So anyways, I've never accepted that offer to let my stuff go on a voice vote ever again.
Well, Tom, we've got a whole bunch of questions. People can come up and ask, but we've got to end this. This is our witching hour. But thank you so much for a great job.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good.